Thanks, Lou. And nice to see a lot of, I recognize a lot of you from last time, so I appreciate you allowing me to be here. So just a little bit of background. Today, I'm going to be talking more about some indoor air quality contaminants and how it relates to defects in buildings that you often find or in homes that may cause some issues related to indoor air quality. A little bit about my background. I am a board certified microbial consultant through ASHI. I'm a certified residential and commercial mold inspector. I am a participating member of ASTM International for air quality and on the subcommittee for the sampling and analysis of microorganisms in workplace atmospheres in that subcommittee, and then the subcommittee for indoor air. Also a member of the Indoor Air Quality Association, American Industrial Hygiene Association, and the Environmental Information Association. So first topic is really, what is indoor air quality and why do we care? So indoor air quality, we breathe about 35 gallons of air each day. That's about 20,000 breaths. And it's all filled with tiny stuff, particles, gases, chemicals. And indoor air quality really relates to both the air that's inside and then outside the building, because we're getting a lot of air, most of the air coming from outside the building, inside. But the indoor air quality impacts health and comfort of building occupants. And according to US EPA, American Lung Association, World Health Organization, Health Canada, indoor air quality pollution is one of the greatest risks to human health. Over the since COVID, a lot of the homeowners and residential people and mom and dads, they've become really keen on what they're breathing, especially when they're been cooped up in a house or in their offices. So they're becoming a little bit more educated, if you will, and a little bit more concerned about what they're actually being exposed to. So how small are these particles that we breathe? So as you can see, that is the human hair, and a typical human hair is between 50 and 70 microns in diameter. A grain of sand, is about 90 micrograms. So we've got small particles that we're breathing in every day. Dust and pollens and mold spores, they're generally about 10 microns or less in size. Those are represented by the blue dots. And then combustion particles, organic compounds, some metals that we're breathing in. Those are measured in usually 2.5 microns or less in size. So why is it important to improve indoor air quality? Well, according to some research, some people are spending about 90% of their life indoors. Air pollution inside can be about 100 times higher indoors than outdoors. Indoor air quality certainly can affect health and productivity. The American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology states that 50% of all respiratory illnesses are caused or aggravated by poor indoor air quality. And poor indoor air quality has certainly been linked to headaches, concentration problems, fatigues, allergies, asthma, and this is according to US EPA. So what are some of the sources of pollutants that you may run into or that the homeowners run into on a daily basis? So we've got biological contaminants. Those are probably, especially in residential structures, these are the most common contaminants that we find. Mold and moisture issues, animal feces, animal insects, bacteria, viruses, they're all shedding, they're all becoming airborne, and people are breathing these in on a daily basis. Indoor air quality also is affected by temperature extremes, temperature and relative humidity extremes, and those can also impact biological pollutants. Particles from smoke, outdoor air, cleaning supplies, those are all other sources of pollutants. Inadequate air circulation and inadequate ventilation of a structure. Carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds. There's tons of sources in a house that produce and emit volatile organic compounds, and I'll be going through a lot of these individually as we move forward. Radon, I'm sure most of you are familiar with radon. And so those are the most common sources of indoor pollutants within a residential structure. First topic I'm going to talk about is mold. And I'm sure, and as I'm going, if you have questions, obviously you can throw them out there, but there are about 1,000 species of mold in the United States. And outdoors, we all need mold. Mold is an integral part of our lives, of life. So outdoors, molds they do break down organic matter, trees, fallen leaves, dead animals. So that's what molds are doing. They are feeding on that organic material. They're a microorganism that feeds on organic matter. But indoors, we want to avoid mold growth. Molds could grow on virtually any substance, anything, as long as there's moisture, oxygen, and an organic source present. And molds do affect structural integrity of buildings, and exposure to these mold spores and mold fragments is a health concern and can be a health concern. So let's do a little fact or myth. If you find mold, you should just kill it. That's a myth. Killing mold is not enough. Okay. Simply killing mold does not remove the effects of allergens or toxins. A lot of these molds carry both allergens and mycotoxins, and where they are in the cell walls of the spores. They kind of protect the spore, if you will. So dead mold is still allergenic, toxigenic. You could still be exposed to it. Don't ever, I strongly suggest, don't ever recommend, just kill it, just spray it, it doesn't work. It's not a proper recommendation. Another fact or myth. All black mold is toxic black mold. That is certainly a myth. So black mold, we typically, when most people think of black mold, they're generally referring to this one particular species called Stachybotrys chichartum. That is mostly associated with chronic long-term water problems, and it likes to feed on drywall, any high cellulose materials, insulation, paper-like materials, ceiling tiles. But it is a very slow grower, so it has a high moisture requirement. But there are several molds that are black in color that are not Stachybotrys. We find that a lot on HVAC vents or on foundation walls where, there's black everywhere, and home purchasers or homeowners like, I've got black mold, we're all going to die. Well, most of the time, no. But there are several molds that are black in color that aren't necessarily the black mold. But it all is, if it's black or green or brown or yellow or white or purple, mold isn't supposed to be growing on building materials. It's not supposed to be there. So there's a reason why these molds are there. So identifying what types of molds are there is really integral as far as diagnosing the issues that are making it conducive for that mold to grow, to be there. Fact or myth? I don't smell mold, so there is no mold. Yeah, that's a myth. Just because you don't smell mold doesn't mean that there is no mold. So when people are smelling musty or moldy-like odors, what they are smelling are MVOCs, or microbial volatile organic compounds. Molds will produce those odors when there's enough available moisture, and different species have different moisture requirements. Not all molds produce odors. Some molds will produce more pungent odors. There's some molds that don't produce any odors, but there has to be enough moisture when they're actively feeding, if you will, to produce those odors. So typically, if there is a musty or moldy-like odor, that generally means that there's also an active moisture source that's causing those molds to grow. So a few statistics and facts about mold. So there are 4 critical requirements for mold growth. There's got to be viable spores. So when mold spores are, if you picture like dandelions, when they're shedding their white things and they're floating around microscopically, when molds are shedding their spores, they're shedding their seeds. Those are the seeds. Not all those seeds are viable. Again, it doesn't matter if they're viable or non-viable. They could still cause health effect or adverse health effects. But for mulch to grow, it needs to have a viable spore or spores to in order to germinate, infest, and grow. There's got to be available food. What foods do molds prefer? Anything organic, anything at all that's organic. Wood, paper, dust, anything that's got that is organic, molds will feed on. Appropriate temperatures. Most molds can grow during with our temperate conditions, anywhere generally between 58 degrees Fahrenheit and up to about 110 degrees Fahrenheit is when many molds can grow, and they all need moisture. Mold needs moisture to grow. The removal of any one of these will prohibit mold growth. Mold spores and molds are omnipresent. Again, we're always around them, so you can't remove mold. There's no such thing as a mold-free environment. It just doesn't exist. What can be controlled is moisture control is really the optimal portion to prevent mold growth indoors. Obviously, our homes and structures are built with a ton of organic sources, so you're not going to remove those. Really, molds can grow again during the typical temperature levels that we have. So what's the number one thing that we could do to prevent mold growth is to control moisture. Any kind of water damage, flood, pipers, leakage can facilitate mold growth, and as soon as 24 to 48 hours. So if materials, if there is a flood or a leak or plumbing leak or moisture coming in from exterior or up through a sump pump. If materials are not dried out within about 48 hours, some species of mold can start to grow or colonize during that period of 24 to 48 hours. So it's really optimal that if there is any flooding or leakage, that materials are dried out within that 48-hour period. As you're going through a house and you see evidence of chronic water, you can see the water staining or efflorescence on foundation walls, or you see water staining or water damage on drywall or on ceilings or on floors. That is a good indication that it was probably more than a one-time event, and there may be hidden mold growth sources. Molds prefer dark spaces as opposed to areas where there's high UV. So most times we find mold in basements, crawl space, or behind walls or above ceilings that are in dark spaces. Humidity control is essential. Humidity is one of the most common causes of moisture problems in buildings. Excuse me, that leads to mold growth. In this region, when we get called and do mold inspections, we get reports, I've never had a leak, there's never been a flood. Why am I getting all this mold growth? And as you see, let's see if this will work. Oh, this is a picture that I took. So what we're looking at is this room had been sealed off. They decided, well, my son's out of town, or my son moved away to college. We closed his bedroom and closed the ceiling vents. And so we don't want to condition that. We don't want to run the air conditioners. It was like that for 2 years. Humidity builds up. That's mold growth on a shoe. I took this picture. It was disgusting. And as I went through that closets and in other areas, you see it on leather jackets, on clothing, on furniture. That is a clear telltale sign that there's humidity-induced growth. When humidity is maintained at or above 60%, that can be enough available moisture, water vapor in the air to absorb into these building materials, clothing, furniture, to allow species of molds to grow. The types of molds that we typically find that are associated with humidity-induced growth, for instance, again, back to this lovely shoe, this greenish color, but it could also be light gray, light white. Usually that's going to be either aspergillus and or penicillium. They're very dry tolerant. They spread easily. They aerosolize easy. So those are the most dominant species of molds that we find growing on when it comes to humidity-induced growth. Yes.
Does it damage the material, or it could just be cleaned off?
What they're doing is they're actually feeding it. So yes, it is deteriorating drywall. It's deteriorating wood, and I have another stat here in just a second. But that's exactly what it's causing structural or damage to whatever it's feeding on, whatever that material is, whatever it's growing on. Now, how long does it take? There's a lot of number of factors, available moisture, how long it's been going on, if it's repeated moisture. Molds will go dormant, during the off season or during seasons when it's cooler and the humidity is down, that mold is still there. Come back into the spring, summer when humidity starts rising, that molds will start feeding again. And so if you see deteriorated drywall, especially on basements or in other rooms where you see crumbling of drywall, usually that's because molds have been feeding on that. But as we're talking about that, according to one of the studies back in 2016, mold destroys more wood than all fires and termites combined. Wood rot. What is wood rot? Those are all molds or fungi that are eating away at that wood. And of course, molds need water. So wood rot is from water. Water is feeding those microorganisms that are eating away, deteriorating that wood. Just a few more mold stats. So the 21.8 million people have been reported to have asthma in the US. According to EPA and Berkeley National Laboratory, approximately 4.6 of those cases can be attributed to dampness and mold exposure in a home. Yes, sir.
So everybody uses the term dry rot, but it's water that's causing the rot, right?
In most cases, yes. So there are some fungi that are more dry tolerant. So all molds are fungi. Not all fungi are molds. You have some mushroom type fungi that are eating. So there's a specific group of fungi called Basidiomycetes. Those are often referred to as with dry rot, associated with wood rot or dry rot, and it appears to be white a lot of times. They are more dry tolerant, but again, I don't know of any area in this region that where rot has started where there wasn't some moisture to begin with. According to Mayo Clinic, 93% of all chronic sinus infections have been attributed to mold. To 25% of the population has a genetic predisposition to make them more susceptible to mold illness. How many of you have had clients that also want mold testing as part of their home inspection? A lot of you do. Again, if you imagine 25% of your clients are likely to have some sort of mold sensitivities or mold, whether it be allergic responses, whether they're immunocompromised. People who are immunocompromised are more prone to mold-related illnesses. Some of them have toxic mold toxicity issues where they can't clear out the mold toxins, where their body can't remove those toxins from their system. So if you think of it that way, 1 in 4 of your clients are likely to have some sort of mold issues, mold sensitivities. So we're going to talk about some sampling for mold. How many of you do sampling for mold? Got a couple of you. Excellent. So mold sampling is an important part of mold inspection of property. However, sampling is not a tell-all. It doesn't tell the whole story. Mold sampling should always be done in combination with a good, thorough inspection of the property in order to avoid some false positives and/or false negatives. The inspection and sampling really should be performed by someone who's trained and understands microorganisms and has a proper understanding of what mold sampling results actually mean. And that's usually done by someone who's been trained and certified as a microbial investigator. But oftentimes you have to kind of think outside the box. So just because you get a certain sample result or you run some samples and they come up with something doesn't always tell the story. Obviously, you all have high knowledge of building construction, have some background in examining certain certain defects within construction. I don't know if many of you understand or have any experience in water restoration and or mold remediation, but there are specific processes and standards and guidelines that are out there for those processes and or indoor air quality. And what that means is being able to understand and fully interpret the results that you're providing proper guidance to your clients. So what is this story? So it's not enough to simply compare outdoors to indoor molds. Indoor samples are really subject to two kinds of errors, and I hope everyone can read that. Yeah, false positives and false negatives. So I'll give you a few examples. And before I jump into that, so if you all are doing, any of you doing air sampling, are you collecting on each level of the home? How many samples? Outdoors, how many samples are you collecting? Those are all key factors. The general recommendation is collect a minimum of 2 outdoor samples, 1 leeward and 1 wayward, okay, of the structure. Real life example, because when we do mold assessments, it is a minimum of 2 outdoor samples, preferably 1 at the beginning, 1 at the end, and or leeward and wayward side of the structure. There was 6 or 7 indoor air samples in this smaller house, and one or two of the samples had Penicillium and Aspergillus that were around 800, 900 spores per cubic meter, when everything else was around 300 to 100 spores per cubic meter. Well, that could be an amplification. One of the outdoor samples had 0 Penicillium and Aspergillus. The other one had 1,200. They were run at the same time, but on opposite sides of the house. So understanding that there was mowing going on or a landscaper, that's going to shoot up a ton of Penicillium and Aspergillus spores. On the back side of the house, if I only relied on 1 sample, I may have gotten a false positive from the indoor sample. So it's really important to understand that having multiple samples is, you have more statistical reliability to evaluate those samples. Here's a couple other examples of a false negative. So let's take a case where mold growth is suspected, but it's not visible. There was we're further assuming that there was a small leak in a water pipe behind a wall, but there's no wet spots, there's no discoloration or signs of mold growth. The only condition is a musty or moldy-like odor. So as an IEQ investigator, I arrived at about 11 a.m. to sample, but the windows and doors have been held open most of the morning to allow a furniture delivery. Even though everything was closed up before I arrived, before the investigator arrives, I take samples and showing that there was no difference between indoor and outdoor samples. So that is a case of a false negative. Does everyone kind of get that concept? You had a lot of outdoor air, whatever was indoors, now you're getting a lot of outdoor air influence. So they were comparable. So that is a false negative. So part of the investigation is we always recommend having the house closed for at least 24 hours, normal entry and exiting. But if we ask our clients, if you're having any furniture being moved in or a lot of activity, that we should not be doing it on that day, any sampling on that day, because we are often subjected to false positives or false negatives. So what is an example of a false positive? So suspected mold growth. Mold growth is suspected in a room, but that has no mold infestation. Before the investigator arrives, someone in the house notices a moldy orange in their closet or in their refrigerator, on their shelf, on their counter, throws it in the garbage. Just that disturbance of a moldy orange can release tens of thousands of spores in the air. We do sampling. All of a sudden, we're getting a super high count of Penicillium and Aspergillus in that room. Why are we doing? So as we're doing an investigation, that's something that I look for, and my inspectors look for, is there fresh garbage? Are a lot of food scraps, especially in the kitchen or in those areas where we are more likely to get a false positive when we're trying to assess for mold growth, hidden mold growth sources.
How long would something like that take to dissipate?
It could take several hours. I mean, generally, we recommend that if something like that is occurring or something like that happens, that really there should be normal activity, but minimal, like throwing out the trash. Lawn mowing, here's a great example of a real life example, anecdotal. We do post remediation inspection and testing. Part of it is sampling. Well, this was a ground level townhome. They had mold growth and damage that affected the room that was directly behind the garage. They cut open the wall, the adjoining wall between the drywall between the garage and that room, and then the side wall. It was all under containment. Went in, and in between the time that the remediation contractor was finished removing all the drywall, doing all the cleaning, running their air scrubbing, air filtration devices, we got called in to do the inspection and testing. And either the homeowner or someone brought in, they decided that they mowed their lawn, they brought their lawnmower back into the garage. We went in and said, I can't sample. I cannot sample because it is going to affect, we're going to get such high spore counts of Penicillium and Aspergillus specifically, and maybe some others, that I didn't want to waste people's time or money by sampling and having unusable results. Another example is how many of you have gone where homes where people are doing composting? And whether it be indoors or outdoors, I've seen tumblers on the outside, either on the back deck or actually I had one where they were doing composting. They had a composter in their basement, did a sampling, and they had a mold sensitized child who had been going in and out of the hospital for years. They couldn't figure out why. There was no mold growth issue in the structure. There was no moisture issue. These spore counts for Penicillium and Aspergillus, honest to God, on that basement level, and we did 4 different samples. It was an average size basement. In that room, 200,000 Penicillium and Aspergillus. The adjacent room, 30,000 Penicillium and Aspergillus. A bedroom, 10,000 Penicillium and Aspergillus. And that compost had not been tumbled or used in several weeks. And we're still getting that amount of spores. That's why in consideration for mold sampling, we have to get as much background information as possible. First of all, why do they want it? And what are the plans to interpret those results? But has there been any history of water damage or moisture issues? Where are those issues reported as? Is it isolated to just, we had plumbing leaks in the kitchen, our dishwasher leaked and it's saturated under the floor, but we can't see mold growth? Have they had multiple flooding events in their basement? What's the weather like? Is it dry? Is it cool? What are the temperatures like? So those all play factors in airborne spore counts, airborne mold spore counts. Mold levels outdoors are a critical factor when comparing to indoor samples. Typically in an indoor environment, the airborne mold spore types and concentrations typically should be within comparable to what's identified outdoors. The American governmental ACGIH, sorry, the American Council of Governmental Industrial Hygienists really is one of the bodies, governing bodies, if you will, that has stated any real stance on what is good, what is bad as far as airborne mold spores. But typically, if it's 10 times greater indoors versus outdoors, the total counts, that is generally considered an amplification site, a fungal lab amplification site. So that generally means that there's likely to be mold growth within that structure. So some essential factors that we need to know about is a complete mold investigation generally is 2 parts. And I may make that 3 parts. First really should be interviewing, getting as much history of the property as you can, moisture issues, things of that nature. But as far as the actual site investigation, the physical site investigation, a good thorough visual exam. Now it is non-destructive. We're not cutting holes in walls or ceilings, but usually there's some tales of history of moisture issues and or evidence of microbial growth. The collection of microbial sampling of microbial samples. So those are the two main parts of a mold investigation. So what's really critical is taking not only your field observations, the history, but also the lab analysis of whatever samples are collected. Then based on those findings of the physical inspection, the sample results, our goal is to not only determine if there's mold growth sources, but why there's mold growth. You could identify mold growth and recommend remediation, but unless that source or sources of moisture has been properly identified, molds are just going to come back. You can do all the remediation that you want, but until the moisture source or sources that cause that growth is identified, molds will return. Excuse me. The types of molds are very important too in identifying likely mold issues. So whenever it hears black mold, Stachybotrys chichartum, that is typically an indication of there being some chronic long-term water intrusion. On air samples, we typically don't find Stachybotrys that much. It's a lot rarer. So if we do find them on air samples, but there's no visible signs, that can be likely an indication that that there has been some sort of mold growth, and they generally don't become airborne very easily unless they're somewhat dried out or have been physically disturbed. It is extremely rare to find them, if at all, on outdoor samples. So Stachybotrys spores, Chaetomium spores, Eucladium, Fusarium. So those types of spores are more indicative there have been being either some history of chronic water issues within the home. So if you are doing any air sampling for mold and those appear on your lab results, that can be a good indication that something at some point in time has either had some sort of mold growth issue. Now, I know a lot of times when homeowners are prepping their house for sale, they may just paint over stuff or put a fresh coat of paint or do some dry lock and think that it's that's going to make everything look pretty. Usually sampling doesn't tell a lie. If there are indications of indoor mold growth, especially on air samples, usually that we're able to identify that. But again, identifying the source of the problem, and it could be a combination, right? There may have been a previous water leak that allowed some mold to start to growing, but then they also have a finished basement, but they keep their vents closed because it gets too cold down there. Well, guess what? Now there's no air circuit, no airflow in the basement, or very little airflow in the basement. Humidity will build up, dampness builds up, that pre-existing mold, if you will. Now the humidity builds up above 60%. Those molds will continue to aerosolize and infest and grow and colonize and spread. So there can be a number of factors of why there might be some mold growth and what those issues are. The types of spores, types of molds, again, are very important. Penicillium and Aspergillus, they are a primary colonizer. What that means is those two species are usually one of the first species to start growing. All molds are competing with each other. So they're fighting over the same food source, right? So the slower growers, Stachybotrys, Chaetomium, usually they're called tertiary colonizers. They're one of the last ones to start growing, and they take a longer time to start to grow. Jumping back to Penicillium and Aspergillus, they usually don't become visible for about 5 to 7 days is when they can start becoming visible. And they could be green, white, gray, yellow, brown. Those are usually some sort of Penicillium and Aspergillus. Things like Stachybotrys, Chaetomium, Eucladium, Fusarium, they're slower growers, and they don't generally become visible for at least 12 to 14 days or 12 to 17 days under certain conditions. Again, appropriate temperature, right available moisture. But again, if they're there and someone just wipes it clean or paints over it, they're still there. The root structures are still there. You get more mold growth, or I'm sorry, more moisture. they start becoming visible again. We get that a lot. Like, hey, I had someone come in and they said that they sprayed it and they cleaned it and they wiped it down and everything was fine, but it's right back again. Yeah, that's because it wasn't properly removed. How many of you have gone into a structure where you see evidence where ductwork has been condensating? Condensation with duct and sweating in ducts will cause a lot of damage and is a really good source for mold growth. Not only for mold growth in the ducts from all the dust and debris that builds up in ducts, but also in the surrounding wall cavities or ceiling. Water droplets will drop on the ceiling, and if it's constant, or even intermittent water, if it's not dried up within 24 to 48 hours, mold growth is likely to occur. I went to a property, it was in Great Falls. I get to the person's house, and honest to God, this was in the summertime, I believe it was either July or August, super hot day, 95 degrees, high humidity, and his doorknob on the outside is sweating. It's literally sweating. I go into the house and I'm like, it is freezing in here. Like, yeah, we keep the temperature set at 64. I'm like, okay. Every single duct chase throughout that entire house was caked in mold growth. Couldn't see it from the outside, from the visible side. Once we started getting into it, every duct chase was caked in mold growth, that drywall, and there was some insulation that got affected by mold growth. So those are temperature and relative humidity control, again, are key factors. There can be multiple sampling methods to help identify and locate sources of mold growth. So the most common is either air sampling and/or surface sampling. We see something, we suspect it's mold growth. We might want to take a surface sample of that to identify what molds are there. Again, if it is visible and it's apparent, is surface sampling necessary? Most times not. Most people are like, hey, if it's obvious and apparent, sometimes it doesn't matter what mold it is, and they don't want to know, we address it. But sometimes if we're trying to identify not only if it's mold, because sometimes it can be very subtle. In a basement that has had no history of leaking or flooding, we go into the base and we see joists are looking a little extra white or gray, but it's not like only isolated. It's like every joist has this white or grayish coating. We thought that was just dust. We do sampling. Nope, that's a lot of penicillium growing up there underneath staircases, especially in basements, inside closets. That's typically because there's humidity control issues. Another type of sampling method that we will often employ, which is generally only done if there's either evidence of previous water issues or something like that, but we're just not sure if there's actually hidden growth sources. It's called wall cavity sampling, where we take a sanitary tube. We either make a hole about the size of a diameter of a pencil, or we take a faceplate off an electric socket, stick a tube inside that wall space, and usually collect multiple samples in between different joist bays to try to determine the extent of likely fungal contamination is. Again, oftentimes, especially if someone just painted over, you're not going to be able to see it. And even if they didn't get a fresh coat of paint, you're not going to be able to see mold growth most of the time. And if you do see mold growth, especially on drywall or on ceiling tiles, what you're seeing typically on the backside, it's usually 100 to 1,000 times worse on the backside. That means that the mold is just coming through and starting to eat it. But for any sampling, there must be a plan to evaluate and interpret those results. So just sampling and handing someone the sample results, well, what does this mean? I'm not sure. What was the sampling strategy? Was there a sampling strategy that was developed? Why are we just sampling for no purpose? May not tell the story. Again, going back to telling the story. Generally, for mold sampling, we collect inside complaint locations, adjacent rooms, multiple air samples on each level of the home is generally what is appropriate to get enough, again, usable data, repeatability, and then if we see any anomalies, then we could have a higher level of confidence that whatever results, if we're getting higher spore counts in certain areas, that it generally indicates that there's indoor growth sources in or near that location. Let me just jump back. Does anyone have any questions or want about mold or mold growth or mold remediation?
So when you say you take mold, say you got a 3-level home, basement, 2 levels, 3,000 square feet, 3 bedrooms, whatever. You're gonna take 2, 4, 6, 8 samples.
It depends on if there's a specific complaint or multiple rooms that may be suspect. So a minimum, and again, when someone calls us, we kind of get history, but if they don't know, we always recommend a minimum of 3 per floor. Plus, if we find any visible signs of growth or moisture issues, we suggest that one of the sample locations be in there. So it is a minimum of 3 air samples per floor at a minimum, plus 2 outdoors.
11.
Yeah. I just did one the other day where we ended up taking 24 samples. And again, costs are a consideration. You know, absolutely, costs are a consideration for those people. But keeping in mind that, you know, if there's spending money on, you know, 4 samples, 1 per floor plus 1 outdoors, so 4 samples on a 3, you know, what value are they actually getting from those results? From an indoor air quality professional perspective, very little value out of that. There's not a lot, and I get those a lot. We get calls a lot. We're like, hey, we had a home inspection done. We got these sample results. What do they mean? They mean very little to me.
So really, people should probably figure on spending like $1,200-1,500 for a mold test.
So it's more than a test. And yes, for mold assessments. So again, it's more than testing. I will never just do testing alone. As far as air sampling goes, never do testing alone. It's got to be a combination of everything. Of what are they complaining about? Are there odors? Is it due to a water issue, a known water issue or previous water issue? They're not sure if there's ever been water issue, but someone in their house is sick. This is from not necessarily a real estate transaction perspective, but from the clients that we get called in about, or they're moving into a house and they know, and this is a lot of our clients, they know their child or someone in their family has mold related illnesses or immunocompromised, and they want to know if there's mold issues or any history of mold issues within that structure. Now, homeowners, if they don't know, that are selling the house, if they don't know, or even if they had mold remediation done, but it wasn't necessarily an insurance claim, they may or may not tell someone about it. And most homeowners don't know. Crawl spaces are one of the worst locations for mold. Especially a vented crawl space in this region. It's brutal. It's brutal. And it certainly can impact the indoor air quality. There are some estimates that 40% of the air that's in the crawl space gets into the living space, whether it be from plumbing penetrations or duct penetrations or other sources. Crawl spaces are horrible. And following up to the previous presenter, and I was geeking out about it when we were talking about crawl space and encapsulation and sealing. So yes, building codes do have codes for either vented or unvented crawl space. We generally recommend that they should be sealed and encapsulated with a dehumidification system at a minimum. And there are multiple dehumidification systems available for crawl spaces and/or conditioned, if it is possible to be conditioned. Again, the number one factor for controlling mold is controlling the moisture. So the vapor barriers should be really a minimum of 12 mil thick. 20 mil is optimal, that doesn't tear. Sealed completely, going up the foundation walls, a minimum of, I believe it's 12 inches or 24 inches, and around the columns. but it should be sealed. If you do go into a crawl space, some of these crawl spaces were constructed when building codes were different, right? Their vents, they may not have the appropriate number of vents, but they may have a dirt floor or they filled it in with some gravel. Moisture is going to come in from multiple ways, rising up from the ground, water coming in from the exterior, and then humidity and or plumbing leaks. That's where moisture is getting into these crawl spaces. So you want to try to control it from water coming up, from vapor coming up from underneath the ground or the side walls. Drainage obviously going to be a huge control, moisture control factor, but also humidity control, and especially in crawl spaces. Any other quick? Go ahead, Lou.
Temperatures within a house, some people like them really comfortable. Some people like them really cold. So I've been in one house where they were keeping the heat temperatures down to like 61, which to me just seems unhealthy as well as uncomfortable. But are there consequences of having extremely high or extremely low, especially temperatures in a house environment that could affect indoor air quality?
Absolutely. So not only for thermal comfort, right, but also for moisture control. Now, if temperatures are kept too low, to get the ambient air to be at 61 or 62 or 63 degrees, the air blowing through those metal ducts has got to be extremely cold, and typically it's going to reach dew point. That metal is going to reach dew point, and you're going to have condensation. But not only that, colder air holds more moisture, so it may feel more comfortable, but actually the water vapor in the air is higher. So it's actually increasing humidity, if you will, in the air. So that is allowing for more moisture to be present. So ASHI, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, has recommended levels of temperature control. This is for thermal comfort. In summertime or in cooling months, as they refer to it, it's generally between the set point between 73 and 80 degrees. And the hotter it gets outside, the higher the set point generally should be. Again, for thermal comfort, you want to run, if you need to run fans, if you like that breeze going, but and in the winter time, it's 68 to 74, I believe is their highest set, or 76 for the set points. And why in the winter time, or in the heating months, if you will, if you're running temperatures too high, they could actually dry out the air. And what happens is, and most people will get this periodically, where you start coughing and you get those mucous membranes dry out because it's too dry. Optimal temperature or humidity ranges, optimal is around 50% year round. And this is not just for mold, this is for viruses, for bacteria, for chemicals or volatile organic compounds. If it's too dry, we see an increased activity in bacteria and viruses, and in some volatile organic compounds. And when I say too dry, generally like around 30% or below, that's when increased levels of viruses, bacteria activity tends to increase. Once it's getting above 50% to around 60, 70%, fungal or microbial growth, activity increases, volatile organic compounds, ozone typically increases with the higher humidity. Optimal is anywhere between 30 and 60% is optimal, is where the recommended ranges for relative humidity should be. 50% is optimal year round. We get people who go away on vacation in the summertime, they go away for 2 or 3 weeks. They're like, I'm not running my air conditioner while I'm gone. Come back home and half their house is filled with mold because they didn't have their air conditioning running and there's no humidity control. That happens quite often. It doesn't take a long time for these molds to start growing. Yes, sir.
So it seems that there's a kind of a catch-22 with this also. because like, for example, in this area, we recommend to most homeowners to have dehumidifiers, especially for the summertime, right? Especially on the older homes, but even the newer homes still need them. But then you see quite a few homes where they're adding humidifiers for that winter time, but then they start running it too much, and next thing you know, you have all the growth in the ductwork. Is to maintain within that same optimal level, that 50% in the wintertime, but to avoid from those problems in the ductwork, is there something that you guys recommend as a way to combat that catch-22?
Yeah, for humidifiers, that we often recommend removing them from the air handling system, because out of sight, out of mind, right? And either those are prone to leakage, to excess water, their drain lines will start leaking, and then you get a lot of mold growth that builds up inside those humidifiers. Most people don't know how to clean those, or don't even know that they should be cleaning them. So we often recommend standalone humidifiers in rooms that they spend the most time in. And then they're inside there, and there's usually instructions on how to clean those fans and clean them out, or they have tabs that you could add to those to keep those as sanitary as possible. For dehumidifiers as well, and most of the time it's on basement levels where we see the most issues, even if they are climately controlled. In some rooms, you know, keeping the fans or the vents open, even if they're unoccupied, making sure that doors aren't closed, you know, keeping at least some air circulation. But in some cases, depending on the size and the configuration and how many rooms, they may need to add 1 or 2 dehumidifiers on a basement level. You know, there's a lot of factors in the size of the dehumidifiers, the configuration of the room. Is it a wide open space, or are there 4 or 5 enclosed rooms in that space? Because a dehumidifier, they've got different ratings and different capabilities, so it really can depend on the size and their ability. But again, if it's a finished basement, there's multiple rooms, they may want to have 2, 3 dehumidifiers on a basement level. Again, does this apply to every home? Maybe not, but at least, you know, I know for my basement, I've got a 3,200 square foot footprint. I was using 2 dehumidifiers, and I still do, but I actually had to change one to a little larger one for a storage area.
Paul, can you repeat those optimal temperature ranges again?
Optimal temperature ranges, and again, this is according to ASHI, for the cooling months, which is whether it be summer when the air conditioning is running, 73 and 80 degrees is what ASHI recommends, and this is for their thermal comfort. And then in the warming months, when you're trying to heat the space, generally between 68 and I believe it's 74, 75 is the higher set point for that. Any other questions? If you think of stuff along the way, we'll certainly get into it. But we'll certainly get into chemical contaminants now that you may be running into. So carbon monoxide is certainly considered a chemical contaminant. And we've got volatile organic compounds and radon. Those are the 3 main chemical contaminants that we run into, especially in residential structures. So first, carbon monoxide, it's a colorless, odorless, and tasteless gas, and it results from incomplete oxidation of carbon in combustion. Sources include unvented fuel-fired appliances and respirable products, particles like from tobacco smoke or wood-burning gas, or wood-burning fireplaces, gas fireplaces, oil burning. Again, carbon monoxide cannot be seen, smelled, heard, but it can be stopped with carbon monoxide detectors. And we'll jump into that real quick. So quick carbon monoxide fact sheet. Normal level in home can be between 0.5 to 5 parts per million for carbon monoxide. Usually we would like to see it at 0, but it can be between 0.5 and 5 parts per million. Near a furnace, which I think if many of you will find carbon monoxide detectors, usually it's near a furnace or something that's heated, but it generally can be acceptable between 5 and 15 parts per million. Carbon monoxide detectors, they're not all the same. Some are more sensitive than others, or I wouldn't say better than others. I would recommend, if you see carbon monoxide detectors, that the threshold, I recommend having a threshold of 15 parts per million for an alarm. Some of them, they won't alarm until 30 parts per million, which according to OSHA, 35 parts per million is a workplace limit for an 8-hour time-weighted average. But once carbon monoxide levels get above 100 parts per million, you got to leave the area immediately. 200 parts per million, you'll get dizziness, nausea, fatigue. 3-hour exposure at 400 parts per million may be fatal. 800 parts per million for 2-hour exposure may be fatal. And then you'll see in red, the higher the parts per million, it will be fatal, and in short time, 1 to 3 minutes. For carbon, so how many of you do see carbon monoxide detectors, and are they actually working, or is that something that you run into and either noted or noted in your reports, or if it's not there, do you recommend it? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Have you found the carbon monoxide detectors that are mounted on the ceiling in conjunction with the smoke alarms as effective as the ones that are mounted midway up a wall?
They're both, the placement is really, there's not a major difference, because carbon monoxide isn't heavier where it sits lower on the ground, or it's going to be pretty
Specific
uniform.
gravity's comparable.
Yeah, it's going to be. Now there are some gases that are heavier than air, so they tend to be at the lower level. But for carbon monoxide, typically we like it at the around the breathing level, or at or near. And typically we'll find them either at around joists, around a gas burning fireplace, or on a stud near a fireplace. Inside, similar to smoke detectors, yeah, because smoke rises, so a lot of the carbon monoxide is associated with the smoke as well. I'm sorry, I thought. Again, I think that as far as carbon monoxide detectors, and alarms, if they have the capability for an alarm set point at 15 parts per million, that's optimal. That's what we generally recommend to our clients, especially if they've got a lot of gas burning, either fireplaces and or furnaces or hot water tanks. That's what we generally recommend. I'll jump back. Going back to carbon monoxide too. If there's an attached garage and the homeowner likes to work on cars and runs the or any engine and is running them in the garage, but they even sometimes they do it in the winter time and they keep the garage door closed and they don't have windows or ventilation. Like, dude, what are you doing? You can't be doing that. So those are other things of consideration. So if you're inspecting a house and the garage really smells of exhaust, you may want to suggest that they either add a carbon monoxide detector directly in that living space, or to right near that entrance, because there could be a higher level right. You walk in from a kitchen or a foyer or a mudroom out of that garage, the carbon monoxide levels, if that is the case, in that specific location, may be much higher than it is in the basement or in a bedroom. So that's just something to a consideration. We're going to talk about some volatile organic compounds and where we often find them. So VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, are carbon-based chemicals. There are thousands of VOCs, naturally occurring or synthetic. They're typically higher indoors than outdoors. Some are highly toxic, others are moderately toxic, and some are just either mildly toxic or just inert. So some sources of VOCs, and here's where we typically find them, is paint strippers, solvents, spray foam insulation. And there's there's kind of, I don't want to say a battle, but energy efficiency. People are spray foaming their attics and spray foaming walls, and they got too much air leakage. Well, that's really impacting the air quality, the indoor air quality. Lack of ventilation, not only that, but also the chemicals in many of the spray foam insulation, not only just the raw material, but also the propellant, the fire resistant chemicals that are also added into that spray foam insulation can make it, they can off gas for a long time. We've had a major increase in clients who've had spray foam insulation, and typically they'll say, all right, stay out of the house for 24 to 48 hours after it's installed, keep windows open. I've had clients where a year later, they're still having, they suspect that they're having issues. And we do specific testing for compounds known associated with spray foam insulation. And we're still getting relatively high counts in their house a year and a half later, because they spray foam, they don't keep windows open, they don't get fresh air in their house, there's no ventilation. So all these chemicals and gases are just lingering in the house. Yes, sir.
Could you just explain how you go about testing something like that? Is there equipment that you use?
Yeah,
obviously?
so we will not only get the SDS, and that's what we typically like to get, is have them provide the SDS or safety data sheet of whatever that product was that was used for the, usually it's the close-cell polyurethane spray foam insulation. Because again, not only does it give there's isocyanates that we're specifically sampling for, but we want to see what other chemicals or compounds are in that ingredient list, if you will, on the SDS. And then we connect with our laboratories that we use, and we do sampling specifically for those compounds. And usually there's a correlation between what we're finding on the sample results and associated with those building with the off gassing. We did one for a gentleman up in West Virginia near Berkeley Springs, where he spray foamed his excuse me, his crawl space. And he was living in his shed or in his trailer outside. He could not go back in his house a year later. He was having that severe reaction. His chest would tighten up. He could not breathe in his house. It was a really small house, a ranch style, 1,200, 1,300 square foot ranch. But he could not stay in the house. And he tried ERV system for ventilation, for air circulation. So we did multiple rounds of sampling and for specific chemicals, and he went back to the manufacturer. We did product testing, so we actually took chunks of the spray foam insulation, sent it to labs for analysis, and they put in an off-gassing chamber to see if it's still off-gassing what they're getting. And sure enough, yeah. So the ingredient list wasn't necessarily now on SDSs, they don't have to provide all the information. So there's stuff that is inside of these materials and in solvents and all these, even in products that say no or low VOCs. That's only a certain required ingredients that, if you will, or chemicals that they're required to list if they are present. Doesn't mean that there's none. And again, there could be additives, there fire retardants, adhesives, resins that aren't necessarily the ingredient of that foam. And I'm going to talk specifically about foam, but they are part of the propellants that are used when they're spraying it in, and those can linger for a long, long time.
I've had a couple clients within the past year or so have had peculiar issues. One guy lived in like a 4 or 5 story, 17-year-old apartment building in Rockville. And all of a sudden he's having reactions to his bedroom. There's another bedroom and it's actually a pretty sizable rental apartment. And but his issues start after 5 p.m. and go into the evening. He had to stop sleeping in his bedroom, couldn't figure it out. I did a VOC test for him. It didn't reveal anything. And the other thing I thought that was a little odd for a younger building was there was a central exhaust duct in the bathroom. attached to the bedroom. But the fact that things were occurring after 5 o'clock made me think it had to do with something going on with one of the other residents within the building. And was wondering now with all the vaping stuff going on and so on and so forth, if that could be a potential thing. He finally just moved out, broke his lease and actually bought a place.
It certainly can. So vaping, most buildings now, or newer buildings, don't allow tobacco smoke, but vaping is not. But there are thousands of chemicals of vaping. But also, typically, if it's a timing pattern, and especially in an apartment building or a condo complex, that may be something going on with the time with their air handling system. So doing indoor air quality assessments, especially in a condo building like that, we like to have the building engineer involved because there may be something going on. The dynamic in the building is changing at a certain time. So usually that can suggest that, because the common areas are generally serviced by a different service for their air conditioning or whatever, as opposed to the units themselves. They may close dampers at a certain time or open dampers at a different time or increase the fresh air intake at certain times. Now, where those fresh air intakes are, that is another factor. I had one building where some of their fresh air intakes that was circulating or for the building was right next to their parking garage. Well, all those car exhaust fumes were coming right into the building. Like, yeah, you probably want to do something about that. But that's a common issue or common complaint is the timing of complaints, right? And part of the investigation for all indoor air quality assessments is, again, getting a background, but a questionnaire, one that we often provide to our clients is, are there timing patterns? What are we, is it consistent? Do you feel better when you go from one room to another? Is it a certain times of the day? We typically ask them to, if they can, keep a journal or some sort of journal, if they don't already have one. A lot of them start doing journals before they contact us. The timing is really is one of the key components. And again, more people are working from home more often, or working in their units, and they're noticing things a little bit more that may be defects either in their home or in the building itself.
Just going to the vaping issue for a second, the primary ingredient of the oils that are boiled basically is ethylene glycol, which is a very nasty stuff. So if you get somebody who's reacting, and ethylene glycol is the thing to look for, because that's going to really cause people do some damage.
So some other VOC sources are aerosol sprays, cleaners, disinfectants. Again, even if they say green or clean or no VOCs, or they've all got something. So those are very common aerosol sources of VOCs, volatile organic compounds. Detergents, air fresheners, and perfumes. Oh, good Lord. I'm sensitive, and my wife and I were looking at houses, and we went into this one house and they had plugins everywhere because they had cats in their house. I literally could not spend more than 3 minutes in that entrance foyer. My tongue and my throat swelled up where I could not breathe. I had to leave the house and nope, we're not even considering this house. Some people are more chemically sensitive than others. I happen to be one that I can't go into a flower shop, even natural flowers. I can't go into a flower shop. I get nasty headaches and congestion immediately. But potpourris, hand sanitizers, and those are all sources of VOCs. Furniture and cabinetry, mattresses, laminate flooring, those are all sources of VOCs. Formaldehyde, that's another compound that is very, very common complaint.
We're at 25 minutes now.
Perfect. So what are some health effects associated with VOC exposure? So the most common complaints are eye, skin, throat irritation, headache, nausea, fatigue, are very common in buildings with elevated VOCs. In general, in an indoor facility or an indoor residential. TVOC that's total volatile organic compounds. So that means the sum of all volatile organic compounds generally can be anywhere between 50 parts per billion and 500 parts per billion, are generally thought to be acceptable. It is often recommended that TVOC levels should not exceed 500 parts per billion. Again, this is a sum of TVOCs. There are thousands of VOCs. If we get, people want to know, they have unknown odors, and we do an odor complaint sampling. So there's different types of sampling methods for volatile organic compounds. The one that we generally employ the most is called the EPA TO15 method. What this means is it's analytically, it's one of the most sensitive, lowest level quantitation then that could identify compounds. But EPA has a list of 73 compounds in this TO15 method where we sit Summa canisters. Usually there's 6 liter Summa canisters that sit on different levels of the home. And it's often used for vapor intrusion as well. But it's a vacuum, and it sits for 72 hours and it just sucks in these Summa canisters. We send them to the lab, and we get not only the identification of any of the EPA registered compounds, but we also recommend and will order a list of TICs, tentatively identified compounds, under this analysis, where they can then list any other compounds that aren't necessarily in the 73 list, but it is a list of 73 compounds. And what we get with that information is also either potential sources of where these compounds are coming from. So any compounds that were identified, we get sources of those compounds. How often are they found? EPA, and there's been several studies that have typical background levels of a whole list of compounds based on studies from 1990 to 2005. And there's an EPA document out there that lists all the different compounds that are generally considered to be background and at what concentrations and how often we see them. So we need to know, is it more of a pollutant source or a source from something inside? But then we also compare the results to American Industrial Hygiene Association has a document called I don't know the exact title, but odor thresholds is essentially what they provide. And that lists over 200 compounds that provides the threshold limit of where someone may be able will smell something or can smell something. Odors are subjective. Not everyone can smell everything at the same levels, but the odor threshold is based on over 50% of the population where they can smell something. And we do compare. So when we're doing an unknown odor complaint or odor investigation, we compare what is identified on the sample results to this document. And lo and behold, if we're getting certain compounds that are above the odor threshold, in the American Industrial Hygiene odor threshold document, you say that's one thing that you're smelling. This has a sweet smell. This has a pungent smell. This has a certain type of smell, an earthy type smell. So then we go back and identify where those sources are coming from. So radon is the next topic that I'd like to discuss. Radon is a naturally radioactive gas that you can't see, smell, or taste. It is present in your home and can pose a danger to your family's health. It's formed by natural radiation decay of uranium in the rock soil. And we just happen to be, especially Northern Virginia, this whole region, there's natural sources of uranium throughout this whole region. And again, it can be found in all 50 states, but I have a map here. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, the map, but radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer in America and claims more than 20,000 lives annually. Radon is the leading cause of lung cancer among non-smokers. And according to Virginia Department of Health, approximately 600 people are believed to die each year from radon-related lung cancer in Virginia. So here's a I'm sure many of you, or if not all of you, have seen this before, the radon zones. So EPA has 3 different zones. Zone 1 are counties that are predicted to have an average indoor radon screening level of greater than 4 picocuries per liter. That is the highest potential, and is zone 1 is in red. And you can see most of the counties, or a lot of the counties in the areas that we serve, are zone 1 or zone 2, which are counties that are predicted to have radon screening level between 2 to 4 picocuries per liter. Those are the orange zone, that's the moderate potential. And then there are zone 3 counties that have predicted average indoor radon screening levels less than 2 picocuries per liter. Do any of you do radon testing as part of your, or do you work with radon? Okay, good. Yeah, we generally recommend it. We don't, I just hired someone who is a radon certified to do the testing, but we will often recommend, so yes, short-term duration during a real estate transaction gives us a good sense. But even if it's below 4, they really should be doing either multiple throughout the year, because it can fluctuate depending on the year. Weather conditions can change. So just because someone has it below 4 and they may not necessarily want to install a radon mitigation system because, hey, their test showed that it's before under 4, we don't need to have it, or the sellers say, no, we're not installing that for you. You know, it's below 4, we're not installing it for you. Year round, it could certainly fluctuate. So EPA does recommend having short-term radon testing and or long-term radon testing, even after a mitigation system is installed multiple times. Go ahead.
So as I understand it, the 4.0 threshold is primarily recommended for real estate transactions to action level, but the EPA recommends having a normal indoor level of below 2.0.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we measure it between 2.0 and 4.0, we should still make a recommendation to our clients to consider remediation.
Yes. Yeah.
And do you know there's a profound benefit to radon mitigation systems, even if the levels are not high?
In short-term testing, radon mitigation.
No, it has nothing to do with it.
Okay.
If you test it, but there's a secondary benefit to having a mitigation system outside of radon.
Well, yeah, I mean, it can relieve some odors or gases coming out from the low slab. There's different
Mustiness
Mhm.
because of the moisture. They're actually very good,
right.
because they're creating a vacuum under the slab,
Right.
or removing all the moist air, and it
Right.
does provide for an environmental improvement.
Yes, I'm sorry. I thought you were. Yeah, I was anticipating a different question, but no, you're absolutely right. I mean that. So not only does it help exhaust radon, but yes, you're right. Any other can help remove a lot of moisture, mustiness. Again, mustiness is a symptom of moisture issues. But yes, so it certainly can. So that's another ventilation, and we'll get into some of that in a little bit.
Sorry, Ian, did you want to go ahead and turn on your mic and pose your question?
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
We sure can.
All right. Thank you for speaking. You've had some good info here. I had some questions regarding the mold that I missed. So I just wanted to double back on that. My first question is, based on what you were saying, how you get a lot of home inspector mold reports sent to you, and you're trying to help the homeowner understand them and make an assessment. So do you not see any value in the quick mold test screening that some home inspectors are performing with like 3 to 5 samples inside and 1 outdoor for the baseline during a home inspection? And the reason we do that is, and when we do those tests, we're usually targeting areas with typical moisture problems like the basement, utility room, and at least something in like a bedroom where they're sleeping and spending most of their time. And the only thing I wanted to throw in there when I'm asking if you see the value in what we're doing is just to remember, in our industry, we're generalists and not normally there to do we're normally there to do an entire inspection on top of mold testing. And what we offer is a screening of the property, not a full mold assessment, which makes it affordable to the client. Most of our clients, they would actually decline our mold test services if we told them the price that we would need to charge them to take 15, 20, 25 samples.
Understood.
And as such, they probably wouldn't get anything done. So wouldn't our screening be better than not having anything done in the real estate transaction at all? So I was just kind of wanting to know your, like, if you do see a value, because, you know, in my initial understanding from the earlier session was that you kind of didn't think there was much value that we were providing with the low level samples that we were what we can offer and the client can afford at that time, because they're already spending like sometimes over $1,000 on the inspection.
Right. No, I completely get it. I don't want to say that there's zero value, because that may give some information, but it's in my opinion, from a analytical standpoint, it's much more prone to either false negatives or false positives. The more limited amount of samples, it may give some information, but it can, and very often leads to more false positives or false negatives of the more limited amount of samples. So can it provide some information? It can. And I hope that you're advising that this is limited data, limited information, and that the clients understand that. Because even with, I can run 30 samples inside of a house, which I don't, but there's always inherent limitations. There's always snapshot limitations, and we advise that no matter how many samples we're collecting, there are inherent snapshot limitations. You're running 10-minute samples, or getting 150 liters of air on each sample. You know, that's a 10-minute per sample snapshot. So there are inherent. So I guess in short, do I think it's absolutely valueless? No. Me as a professional, when I get a lab report without other pertinent information, could I look at that lab report and give someone, say, hey, yeah, this house is great, or no, this house is no? I can't.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I guess just from our industry, being able to offer some form of screening that the client can tack on and afford, is that worthwhile doing, or should we, in your opinion, should we not even be doing it to begin with?
No, and again, I don't think anyone should or should not be, but it's a matter of what the client values and making sure that they understand what they're really getting. I mean, there are many clients are becoming more and more educated, and they have they're doing some sort of due diligence, and usually there's a reason why they're looking for mold testing, as they call it, mold sampling as part of it. And usually during a home inspectors, obviously you're going to note if there's any defects, obvious defects related to, hey, we got wood rot here, we've got, water damage or water staining here. So in those scenarios, yeah, there may be some added value. But to assess a structure, if there's mold contamination or mold growth within the structure, without the other aspects of thermal imaging and moisture testing and getting a background, a history, it's similar to like a doctor. You go into a general doctor, they may do a screening and may do run some high level tests. Everything kind of looks good, but we can't tell you more than that. Where they may recommend, or put it in this way, as a home inspector may recommend having further evaluation by a specialist. There's doctors, specialists, not all doctors specialize in everything. So I think that is where we often will get involved, where a home inspector runs some samples, and maybe those samples appear to be okay, but there's evidence of water staining or water damage, and they may still say, hey, you may want to have more of an in-depth specialized investigation to diagnose the issue. So that may be a good way to think of it, is like when people go to their family practitioner, that doctor isn't a specialist in everything. They are running some tests if they think that it's warranted or maybe necessary to help aid that client into giving them some information that may be valued to them. I don't say what's valuable to a client or not. If I'm going to provide information, and that's really what I'm trying to provide clients is information that they're ultimately hoping to accomplish. Well, how do I get the appropriate information where I can render a professional opinion within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that XYZ is that this structure appears to be okay, or no, there's evidence of fungal contamination. So I hope I'm answering your question as good as possible. Do I think that it's absolutely valueless? I don't. And I don't discourage anyone from offering those results. Just when someone comes back and has questions about what do these results mean, just be aware that there can often be a lot of positive false negatives.
Yeah, and then we would defer them to a specialist like yourself if there were some significant concerns on the report saying you need a further assessment, a much more in-depth assessment, and that's beyond the scope of what we provided.
Right.
Okay. My second question real quick is regarding your comment that we should really be taking at least 2 outdoor samples. Again, just going back to, samples cost money and we're trying to keep this as affordable to the client as possible. Wouldn't it be okay to do just 1 outdoor sample if you always took the sample on the windward side? Because taking it on the windward side would effectively capture any outside elevated spore counts that would cause a false positive. So why would there
Not
be a need for a
always.
leeward side test?
So windward side, oftentimes, if it's more windy, those spores may be blowing right over that trap, right over that cassette. And they may not actually be captured in the cassette. I believe it's ASHI also suggests that if it's doing it, that 2 outdoor samples are optimal. Again, there's no set regulation or requirement. One is definitely needed. And I've seen somewhere somebody did 0 outdoor samples. That's completely useless to me. 1 is the minimum amount. 2 is optimal, and depending on the length of time that someone is there, I could be going through a house and we may be there for 3-4 hours, depending on the size of the house. If we start at 9 a.m. in the summertime, and it's 68, 70 degrees. As it starts heating up and humidity rises pretty quickly, and the temperatures come out, we may get some really high differing counts throughout the morning, mid-afternoon. So the time of day, the temperature outside, the weather conditions certainly do play a factor in how we decide when and where outdoor samples are collected. And we may want to suggest to our client that, I collected 1 at the beginning and 1 at the end. And if I'm going to be here for 4 hours, I may want to do 1 in the middle because, that can give us a clear indication. Again, costs are absolutely consideration. So definitely 1, optimal for at least 2 is really preferable. I shouldn't say optimal is preferable. And then there are labs. I know we use Eurofins, EM Lab P&K, and Chantilly, where the report that we order from them also gives us statistical analysis. They have a database of, we put in the zip code of where the samples were collected. They have an outdoor range for that month, typical outdoor range for that month, and then the year for that based on the zip code. So that gives us more statistical analysis. Again, it does cost us more to get that report, but again, more analysis, the more data that we can provide, the more comfortable we are in giving our clients any real statistical or analysis that we deem to be a little bit more reliable.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. And I'll have time for a few more questions. Because I've only got a few more minutes, maybe 5 minutes left. Radon why is radon a concern? Again, it decays into radioactive particles known as radon decay products. Those RDP particles are easily inhaled and deposited in the lungs and damage lungs. I know there's some, I believe they're the alpha tracks where they actually impact and they cause the dimples, and that's what it's doing in your lungs. And decays into plutonium-218 and plutonium-214 and emit alpha particles, and those particles strike lung cells, causing physical damage and or chemical damage to the DNA. So that's why radon is really a concern.
A question along those lines. Is it only the decay products, or can the levels of radon actually influence other dust particles just in the air?
So it's really the radon decay products are the primary concern. So when you're measuring for radon, we're worried about the ultimate decay of those radon decay particles, and that's what we're most concerned about. And it can be in water too. And I'm sure many of you know that it can be in water. And actually, we've done well water testing for radon specifically. So that is something that is a concern as well. So when you're showering, typically it's going to be in basement levels or the lowest level of the home, but it can be in the water as well. So last 5 minutes, because then we're defects in a home contributing to poor air quality, and this is where most of you will come into play. So moisture control issues, so plumbing leak, poor drainage, gutters and downspouts, condensation issue, humidity control issues. Usually you identify or can identify many of those defects within a structure that cause moisture issues. Poor ventilation, over insulated attics. We not just spray foam, but we've gone into many attics where they added insulation and they covered over their soffit vents, so the attic is not breathing, and humidity and moisture gets trapped in there. We run across that quite often, and then the roof sheathing and the trusses or rafters are just caked in mold growth because they just sealed up their attic too tight that the air can't escape. Bathroom and kitchen exhaust vents not vented to the exterior. Dryer vents too. Dryer vents, if they're damaged inside walls or long runs and the flexible vent ducts are cracked, and that's adding a ton of moisture into the air. Cracked sewer vent stacks, if they're cracked, we will often get complaints of sewer gas odors, and usually that's the cause for that. Undersized or oversized HVAC systems for the structure. Inoperable windows. People don't open their windows enough. Fresh air, getting more fresh air. We want to let the stuff that builds up naturally in these houses to vent out. It's got to get out of the house. And a lot of people don't even, I've had some clients that said, we've never opened our windows. What? They don't even have screens on their windows. I'm like, open these windows. But inoperable windows, I know you all look at windows and if they're inoperable, especially if there's a lot of them that are inoperable and they can't open them, that can be a contributing factor to poor indoor air quality for that homeowner. Unvented fuel-fired appliances, and then no radon mitigation. So those are a lot of defects in a home that are contributing to poor indoor air quality. Do you all have any more questions? We've got about 2 minutes left. Is that correct, Hollis and Lou? No? All right. Yes, Lou.
One last question. Do you do, when you're in testing and there may be a potential need, do you actually do invasive investigation, wall cavities and stuff like that?
So either during an initial investigation, it's rare, we may suggest it, and if the client agrees to it, we will. Oftentimes, we don't see anything, everything is visible during the non-invasive, moisture testing, thermal imaging, everything appears to be fine, but we get some odd air sample results. At that point, we will suggest, and we've gone back to structures to do more invasive sampling methods such as wall cavity. Not all wall cavities are a good candidate for sampling. If they're filled with insulation, we can't do any wall cavity sampling because, again, what wall cavity sampling is, it's essentially taking an air sample. You use a spore trap cassette connected to a pump. You draw air through the pump, but there's an adapter that connects to the top, and you stick a tube inside that wall space. So you're isolating that area of that cavity space behind the wall. Just before you're doing the sampling, while the sample, you're gently tapping the wall. or if it's a ceiling, gently tapping the ceiling to release any hyphal fragments or spores that may be growing back there. Too much dust or too much debris can impact that sample, the lab analyst's ability to analyze that sample. So we really have to judge when is the best and optimal way to do that type of sampling.